The ancient myth of the Labyrinth, a colossal maze constructed by the genius Daedalus for King Minos of Crete in order to hold a monster, the Minotaur, is one of the most captivating ideas in cultural history. The idea of a maze that contains a monster is not only a springboard for all kinds of imaginative games of make-believe, both with and without rules, including modern tabletop RPGs, but it also serves as a captivating series of metaphors. Navigating a labyrinth is a very easy way to talk about attempting to complete a difficult task, and the monster that lurks within the labyrinth, the Minotaur, can easily represent any sort of difficulty we might encounter in the course of trying to complete that task. The labyrinth, more specifically, has been a metaphor for our relationship to information and knowledge. Much in the same way as our minds are easily confounded by a wealth of information, so does one get lost in the labyrinth. In Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro, the eponymous interlocutor accuses Socrates of being like Daedalus, constructing a labyrinth of questions and making him go back and forth, getting lost. And if you consider the phenomenon of libraries, those storehouses for such knowledge, they too are constructed in such a way as to have us get lost in them. And thus we find a thematic dovetailing between, on one hand, the labyrinth as a metaphor, and on the other, the architectural housing for the thing for which it's a metaphor. Libraries as storehouses for knowledge imitate the structure of a maze in the same way that a maze itself is a metaphor for knowledge. Now, when you add on top of this the fact that in the original and in many versions of the myth of the labyrinth, the Minotaur is a prisoner of the labyrinth and not just its master, we can find a rich metaphor for two kinds of scholarship. There's one sort of scholar who, Theseus-like, traverses the labyrinth following the Ariadnean thread of truth, trying to find his way out and to achieve enlightenment with contact with the external world. And then there's the scholar who, Minotaur-like, never gets out from amongst the shelves and footnotes, forever prowling the depths of the library itself, never able to bring knowledge to light. Indeed, in Goethe's famous poem, Faust, the titular scholar begins as the second sort of creature, and with a little help from Mephistopheles, becomes the former. Welcome to PhD&D, everyone. I'm Dr. Bowers, and we're going to talk about labyrinths in your game of Dungeons & Dragons, or really in any tabletop role-playing game. As I hopefully demonstrated in the introduction to this video, a labyrinth is something that is heavy with themes. It can represent all kinds of events and ideas, and that's just in addition to the fact that mazes are beautiful, and they're fun to explore. Indeed, the very first iterations of the role-playing game hobby featured underground mazes called dungeons. And the idea of a dungeon as a maze is so basic to the hobby that it almost doesn't need mention. And yet there are a couple of mistakes which are easy to make when presenting a dungeon to your players, just as there are a couple of elegant tips for running a maze well. The first and most important rule is this: do not use one single giant maze that fits all on one map. Even though it's tempting to do this, even though some of the most celebrated dungeons in the history of our hobby, such as Castle Greyhawk, did exactly this, you should not do it if you want your players to enjoy the maze. There are a couple of reasons for this, and the first is quite simple. It's just not that exciting to map out corridors. Going down a long hallway, finding that it bifurcates, choosing one of the directions, and then finding it dead ends, and then going back and trying the other bifurcation, only to find that it leads you back around to the first corridor, is a form of exploration, and it can be exciting, but it's usually not the most exciting thing about exploring a maze. If you've ever watched the movie Labyrinth, you'll notice that the most interesting, exciting, and memorable events do not occur when Sarah and her companions are wandering around corridors trying to find the way to the exit. Instead, they occur in wide open spaces, big rooms, chambers that hold a whole village or a swamp. And as for the actual maze parts of the labyrinth, they are only presented in the course of montages, conversations, and other transition beats. And just as it is in this movie, so it should be in your campaign. The most exciting things in your labyrinth are going to be the rooms in which there's a social interaction, or some combat, a riddle, or a puzzle, or maybe even a giant multi-part room-sized trap. Now, you can put these things in a large maze that fits all on one page, of course. But one problem is you can't guarantee that your players will ever find those things. They might spend 5 sessions in a row just middling about corridors, going back and forth, finding dead ends, going back, and repeating this process. If you want to run a labyrinth well, you want to be able to guarantee certain kinds of story beats, certain kinds of encounters in which the players are rewarded for solving something, or they're excited by a change of scenery. And you can't guarantee that in just one giant maze on one page. Now, a second reason not to use one giant maze that all fits on one map or one page is just that those things are appealing for reasons that are not accessible to the players. Let me put it this way. Here's how we enjoy a maze. First, we look at the whole thing in its entirety. Mazes are beautiful. If you've ever looked at the series of books, Amazing Mazes, you know what I mean. You should check those out. We take a look at the whole maze in its entirety. We see all the twists and turns. And, fascinated by the view of the whole, we scour the map for that area that's labeled Start, or Entrance, and we see if we can trace away from that point to the point that's labeled Finish, or Exit. That's how we enjoy big mazes that fit on one page. But if you're playing Dungeons & Dragons, or another tabletop role-playing game, and the maze is the dungeon that the player characters are going to explore, then you are not going to show them the whole maze in its entirety, or probably not. Their relationship to the maze, in other words, is not going to be the relationship which constitutes enjoying it. From their perspective, they're going to be in a hallway, and then they choose which other hallway to go through. And each of those hallways is connected with other hallways. That's not nearly as fascinating as being able to behold the maze as a visual work of art, see it in its entirety, and then try to solve it in a way that is markedly distinct from how player characters would solve a maze that they're in. So don't use giant labyrinths that all fit on one page. Don't use some mega maze that's just on one map. It's likely to get boring, and it's just not the way to make a maze enjoyable for players or their player characters. Instead, you should break up your labyrinth into a series of smaller mazes, each having its own map. This accomplishes three things. First, it guarantees that there's going to be plenty of positive reinforcement to encourage the player characters to keep exploring. They start out trapped in a smaller maze that's easily solvable, they solve it, they get encouraged, and then they move on to the next map. This is very different from being trapped just on one map and going one way and then going another way and then going back and then going forth and not necessarily making any progress. Secondly, by breaking your labyrinth up into smaller maps, it guarantees that you're going to have periodic changes of scenery, or at least that you can if you want. It is true that if you're running a giant maze that fits on one map, you could change the scenery as the player characters explore it, but it's difficult to do that in a way that doesn't make it seem like you're erasing characters' progress, trying to trick them, and hampering their efforts as adventurers. If you break your maze up into different maps, you could have one map be a forest hedge maze, and another section of the labyrinth be a maze of mirrors. In another section, maybe they're flying through the air amongst a maze of clouds. You can get really imaginative with it. And thirdly, if you have a series of short mazes which constitute your labyrinth, you're able to better schedule and organize the kinds of story beats that you're going to want. If you wanted the player characters to encounter a sphinx that poses a riddle to them, it's easier to make sure that they'll encounter it on a smaller map. Or if there's a room that holds an NPC or a certain sort of combat encounter you want to trigger, again, it's easy to make sure that they find it on a smaller map. So those are a few reasons why dividing your labyrinth into a series of smaller mazes on different maps is better. This is how Wizards of the Coast did it in Tomb of Annihilation. The Tomb of the Nine Gods is one giant labyrinthine mega-dungeon, but it's divided up into a series of levels, different sorts of maps with a different qualitative character that have events which are very easy to schedule. It's also how they did it in Dungeon of the Mad Mage. Arguably one huge labyrinth, the multi-level Dungeon of Halaster, which constitutes that module, is divided into a series of levels, each level being a maze unto itself with a different qualitative character and some events which are relatively easy to schedule within the space of each level. And those are the two basic principles, really different ways to express a single principle, that I advise when it comes to running labyrinths. As for some of my own favorite labyrinths in fiction, there are three that come to mind. The first is the house on Ash Tree Lane, featured in Mark Z. Danielewski's House of Leaves. It's a small house, but if you go inside, you'll find that there's a door, which, architecturally speaking, should lead outside the house. It's a door in the wall, an outer wall. But upon opening it, people instead find a long corridor leading to who knows where. And that corridor connects to other corridors, and stairways upon stairways, and branching hallways. Whole expeditions are led into the depths of this house. They run out of rope, they run out of supplies, they die in the cold and the dark, tens of miles into the depths of this house. And, as this house's depths are described, the text of the book House of Leaves adopts its own labyrinthine character itself. revealing footnotes upon footnotes, commentaries upon commentaries of an ever-increasingly complex and diverse character. The reader is led down a labyrinth of words, just as the literal characters are led into a labyrinth that is the depths of this house. And the author, Danielewski, very effectively conveys a captivating idea of language itself as a labyrinth. Language as a house or a structure that you cannot get out of. Words referring to other words, meanings that make reference to other meanings, but with no single linguistic item that ever seems to bridge the gap between language and world to fully express what it feels like to be. Or something like that. It's one of my favorite labyrinths. Another one of my favorite labyrinths is the Library of Babel by Georges-Louis Borges. This is a structure, presumably infinite in size, that is just one gigantic library. A series of hexagonal rooms. Every wall has the same number of shelves, every shelf holds the same number of books, every book has the same number of pages, and every page has the same number of lines with the same number of characters on each line. Presumably infinite in size, the library holds every possible book. Every combination of characters that ever has been written, is written, or will ever be written, or could ever be written, is stowed somewhere upon those library shelves. And so there is a book that describes your whole life. Your bibliography is doubtlessly on one of those shelves. And so are millions and millions of false bibliographies about you, and hundreds upon millions of bibliographies of people who never existed, and for each person who has existed, a billion bibliographies for them. Every mote of dust has a bibliography, every blade of grass that could have grown. And that is to say nothing of the countless volumes of gibberish, just random letters, which, according to the narrator in Borges' story, overwhelmingly outnumber any volumes in which there's a clear semblance of meaning. The narrator describes how the library is the only thing which he or anyone has ever known. Indeed, the first line is, "The universe, which others call the library," and he describes all kinds of fascinating religious movements within the library. Brigades of self-appointed officials who would go from room to room, leafing through volumes, and, scowling upon finding nonsense, would then rip the pages up or hurl them down the infinite shafts of the library to fall and decay in the vast air. It's fascinating, it's brilliant, and I especially like the idea that an infinite space could be a labyrinth. We tend to think of a labyrinth as necessarily finite, it's confining, it holds you in. But really, a maze is just something constructed so as to mislead and spatially confound those inside. Across an infinite space, how could you not get lost? And the idea of infinity as a labyrinth is this captivating theme that kind of comes to the mind when you read it. And a third favorite labyrinth of sorts is that featured in Franz Kafka's The Burrow. This is a completely different take on the theme. Here, the labyrinth is a source of security, a place where no one can find you because you're at the center of a protective complexity. In order for a predator to get to you, it would have to navigate the labyrinth, but it could never navigate the labyrinth. You have made it too complex. You have thought of every single thing. The musings of the narrator who dwells in the eponymous burrow, their paranoid reflections offer a really imaginative way to think about how the labyrinth might appear to those who dwell within it. And finally, an honorable mention must go to the Labyrinth Virus designed by Grant Howitt and Christopher Taylor in their RPG Heart. In the world of Heart and in the world of Spire, there's a virus or a curse which people get, and it compels them to start building a maze. They are driven to start stacking things, piling things, and hooking things together to make a labyrinth. And once that labyrinth gets big enough, it's not just a labyrinth, it becomes part of the labyrinth. A vast maze spanning across dimensions. And within that labyrinth there is indeed a Minotaur. But here Howitt and Taylor go to the extreme when thinking of the Minotaur as a prisoner of the labyrinth. It's really amazing. They think of the Minotaur as too big for the maze itself, to the point where one of its arms is shoved down a single hallway, and another arm or leg is shoved down a different hallway or corridor, and it pushes itself through the corridors or tries, bruising its skin, tearing its muscles and ligaments, never able to stretch or stand. It's like the idea of claustrophobia turned into a monster. I love it. And so those are some of my favorite labyrinths. Anyway, what do you think? What are some of your favorite labyrinths from games or from literature or from movies? And how do you run a labyrinth in your tabletop role-playing games such as Dungeons & Dragons? Let me know in the comments. As always, thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and if you want notifications on updates on this channel, which I provide weekly, hit that bell icon as well. Thanks very much. See you next time.